Hi there. Welcome to, I thought I would do a short lecture on ecosystem services and how we can use them to establish markets. I just realized that door looks a little messy. So I'll just a quick 8-slide video. It's going to reinforce some of the points made in the TED Talk. So let's get started with that. So using ecosystem services to create markets and environmental value. That's where I want to get to. And so what I'd like to discuss is, in terms of that concept of environmental efficiency in environmental markets, are we getting enough environmental protection? Like, are we getting an economically efficient amount? I want to talk about market failure and what are some ways that we might not be getting enough environmental protection and stewardship. What are some ways to approximate the value of the environment? And we have been talking about that in decision-making tools such as cost-benefit analysis. We can also use some approaches to environmental evaluation where we might actually address some market failures, create some markets. This is again like what the material was in the TED Talk. Who is at the forefront of creating some of these markets at this point? And how do we practically do this? And then a little bit about answering the question about who should actually pay. Who should pay whom? That was a question that was also raised in the TED Talk. So I'm going to give, just since we're talking about drinking water and watersheds this week, watersheds and their functions are typically treated as a public good. Now, we've been using this term, but I don't think we've defined a public good. A public good is one which can't be effectively captured privately. Because, for example, I have a really difficult time capturing my own private air. I can treat the air inside, and then I have a private good. But outside air, it's hard to really capture that. And there's many ways that water is hard to capture. So one aspect of a public good is it's hard to capture. It's also hard when you degrade a public or a common good. You typically degrade that for everyone and not just yourself. And so that's one of those ideas, like the tragedy of the commons isn't about common goods. But public goods, more specifically, are typically those ones that we have provided through public action or protected through public action. So watersheds are typically protected from unsustainable use through regulation and use limits. And the costs of some of those are borne by private actors. For example, a forest company might not be able to log everything from seam to seam. Some of those costs are borne by the government, because if you can't clear cut everything right from creek's edge to the mountaintop, then the government won't get as many royalties. And the benefits of watershed protection are received by the public, which is again people that they might pay sort of indirectly through their taxes. They might value those benefits quite differently. And so that's a kind of a messy and imprecise way to receive a benefit for free. In other words, you receive the same benefit whether you pay for it or not. So are we stewarding watersheds at an economically efficient level? So an economically efficient level would be one in which the general welfare is maximized. People are happiest with how their dollars are being used. I could pay an extra dollar or two, get cleaner air, if that's my preference. So are we getting enough? So as I said, in the free market ideal, we should be able to choose those goods and benefits to pay for according to our values, and we should be able to avoid bads and costs in the same way. So for most environmental goods, we cannot effectively make those choices. There's no way to pay for cleaner air. I can possibly locate in a place that has clean air, but what if my neighbor moves next door and starts, burning tires in the backyard? It depends on the state of regulation whether I can keep the benefit that I chose. So my example is that like person A might prefer to pay a small amount to protect an environmental good such as water quality rather than a large amount to attempt to restore it. But even if there were thousands of person A's and you could make a profit protecting the environment, there might not be any point at which person B, a resource user, could actually ask for that payment for that protection. For another perspective, person B, the resource user, might be incurring some costs for like avoiding the stream or not being able to log as much of the tenure, but still negatively affecting the public value of a resource. This can happen if we don't invest enough public funds or public resources. This is kind of what's happening now, so we don't have quite the stream buffers to protect the stream. So we are harming aquatic ecologies and harming water quality and temperature, and eventually fish populations. So in a sense, person B is spending the public good accounts of person A, and person B is not required to compensate person A. So those are two environmentally inefficient situations. So we've talked around some of these in cost benefit because we needed to do an economic perspective cost benefit analysis. You have to be able to price goods that might not have a price assigned from the market. And so some of these are a review. So for example, willingness to pay is typically hypothetical. If you could pay to protect or preserve an environmental good, how much would you pay? And it's easy to over or underestimate what that would be. It can be modeled from decisions that people make, although it's not always obvious if they're making those decisions based on those preferences. You can look at the price. You can look at the difference in prices. For example, in land with varying degrees of toxic loads and lead and metals or other toxic pollutants. So you can look at, the effect of pollution on land value, and then you have a certain figure for willingness to pay to avoid that. Although again, there's some factors mixed in with that. And you can also try to model a price differential in real estate with clean air rather than without it. Although again, a lot of cofactors in real estate location choice models. But basically, you try to model the amount that people are willing to pay to obtain a benefit or avoid a risk and use that in your model for a value for that environmental good. You can often value the cost of alternatives. Now this should be a very important part of cost-benefit analysis, because if you're going to have the most efficient way of achieving a goal, you'd want to evaluate the price of many alternatives. But with cost-benefit analysis being as complicated as it is, it's sometimes difficult to model alternatives. But in certain situations, it's possible to figure out the cost of getting the same good. So cleanup or restoration cost, if we did not protect or preserve a resource, how much would it cost to clean it up to original condition? So that is the basis of mining regulation at the moment. The mining companies are expected to restore land surface to some approximation of original condition. But we can also look at a service like pollination, and we can figure out if we had to pollinate a crop by hand, how much would it cost for us to pollinate by hand instead of having the bees do it, and how much would it cost to protect the bees. So then you have two alternatives and you can price them. Now getting closer to ecosystem services, there can be a use value. There's a sort of an income stream from an ecosystem, or getting to some sort of sustainable level of use. So if an ecosystem can pollinate or can provide clean water, that's something it's going to do every year if it's kept in reasonable shape and not degraded. So then you have an income stream, which in economics is an interesting thing besides an asset. So what would it cost to provide the same service through capital and labor investments is another way to value an ecosystem service. And finally, you can value an ecosystem event by consequence. So you can use the difference between prices before and after event to come up with the cost of that event to wealth. So for example, you can evaluate what the cost excuse me, of Hurricane Katrina was to property holders by looking at the total property values before the event and then subtracting the total property value after. Then you have the total wealth cost of Katrina. So then, just extrapolating from that, so from that you'd be able to do some thinking about changes you might need to make in insurance costs, or the value of seawall investments, or other kinds of what are some of the costs of climate change, of not acting on climate change. You would be able to predict through the increased frequency and severity of storms that you would have a certain frequency of these losses in value, and along with great other costs, but you could value them through this method of consequence of each natural event. So we're again you have a couple of readings where you're looking at slightly different values for environmental services or eco assets and natural capital. And some people use the terms interchangeably, and other people distinguish for cost accounting reasons, between capital assets and between goods and between services. From an economic valuation perspective, I don't find that compelling, but I think it's when you're trying to get into the depths of these methods, it probably has some importance. But for our purposes, environmental services are those services such as cleaning water, pollinating crops, protecting us from storm surges or floods that the environment could do. It's often far more economical to protect or preserve a service that the environment is providing than to either rebuild it or restore it to some level of performance, of environmental performance. So who's using these approaches now? Well, utilities, and we'll look at some examples for drinking water. Utilities are paying for ecosystem services to lower costs in drinking water, water treatment, and flood control. Now they're doing this two ways, which I guess I'll get into, but for some utilities are paying for total protection, and some utilities are paying, depends on the size of the watershed and the size of the community. Some of them are just paying for better conservation practices. So governments can include the value of ecosystem service benefits in their decision making to try to get a good fit between a social and environmental investment levels and that overall wealth, the overall sum of economic welfare. And then what we're looking at this week is where NGOs can organize different kinds of payments for ecosystem services, NGOs or utilities, between donors or beneficiaries. Sorry, we're looking at utilities this week, but NGOs can also organize these payment systems or markets. So we have examples like payment for ecosystem services and conservation programs. So one form of the market failure that we were looking at is when there's really no effective market that exists for me to pay more than I'm currently paying for environmental protection to express that preference. And so some of these, it's important to think about whether or not people have the opportunity to express the value they have in environmental protection and stewardship. So when I say creating a market, I mean creating the opportunity for people to either make a payment to express a preference or avoid a consequence, or help to pay for stewardship, or pay for even to help restore what they themselves had done. It's any way for users, resource users, and beneficiaries to make some kind of mutual exchange kind of market. So some of I'm just going to fix that spelling right now. There. So one of the classic ways that that NGOs do create markets for finances is in providing opportunities. You can donate for conservation causes. So you can send a certain amount of money to Audubon or to any number of environmental NGOs to fund protection and conservation as a way of expressing your preference to sort of increase the regulatory effect or the on-the-ground stewardship or the acquisition of large landscape protections. You can personally try to contribute towards those goals. This allows what's called armchair participation, but it also it creates that market in expressing that preference. It does tend to work best for charismatic environments, species with some aesthetic or cultural appeal. Oh, I use some. There's mostly wildernesses and sort of more charismatic animals, charismatic megafauna, as they're sometimes called. And so the organization provides a way for a contributor to pay to express their preference for protection or conservation. This text is a little small. So I wanted to do eco-asset slightly differently because sometimes people use this term. An eco-asset is a way of referring to the capital value of a natural asset. So a capital stock provides some income of economic benefits. So someone might say that we have an eco-asset, we have a tourism asset, or we have a hunting or fishing asset. So we have a certain income of economic benefits that we derive from a certain environmental context. And some of those benefits come to the community. And so how do we get a portion of those put back into conservation activities? So for example, eco-asset type activities might be ecotourism, fishing, hunting. So we have a stock of natural resource. Types of income streams that you could look to would include tourism activity, accessory sales for different kinds of tourism and outdoor activity accessories, accommodations, restaurant activities. Now, some of the higher impact activities also tend to be those with the highest economic benefits. So, ATVs and large motorized use, those users do tend to spend more on accommodations and accessories than the lower impact users. That's just what the studies show in my area. But you could calculate the value of the environment to the community as a sort of a regular income stream. And you ought to be able to start to look at what is the limit that the asset can provide before it starts to be too degraded to be competitive with other environments. Whoops. So to create a market, again, you provide a mechanism for users and the consumers of the resource to contribute to conservation and stewardship activities. So groups that do that are ecotourism groups like Ecotourism Ireland, the Centre for Responsible Travel, And then the way it's very typically done is through Fish and Game license fees. So a portion of each license fee is funds conservation. So back to this ecosystem services concept. Again, I'm throwing these terms around. It's also been called green infrastructure. And that's so that, and you'll see that in the articles that we're reading, green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. So in drinking water, water users can pay for conservation practices instead of treatment costs that they might otherwise have to undertake. You might have to build a plant. So across the United States, several water utilities, and we'll be looking at those case studies, several water utilities bill customers for the cost of upstream conservation management. In some cases, there are sufficient consumers to pay for complete protection, as in the New York City drinking water watershed. New York City Water was able to purchase the land around their primary water source, and it's often cited as innovative environmental policy. They actually did look at that. They did do the alternative cost valuation of building a plant versus acquiring the land in their source water watershed, and it was the lower cost alternative to buy up that land. So in other cases, the water utilities are willing to just pay for upstream best practices in agriculture and forestry, depending on the location, to improve that green infrastructure, to avoid having to increase investment in gray infrastructure or capital plant facilities. And I think where ecosystem services, sorry, jumping around there, where ecosystem services typically come in is where local and or higher level governments organize residents and taxpayers to pay towards environmental services, to make some payment. So services that would otherwise need to be provided through capital investment. And here we're looking at things like flood control or non-point source pollution cleanup, services that avoid catastrophic costs from events such as rainfall, flood, or landslide. And we'll look at more of these next week. So in these, program benefits can include reduced insurance costs, reduced capital investment costs, lower overall program costs. You can see how some of these tend to have they tend to be more workable at a larger regional scale. So what we're going to do this week is look at some case studies where markets are created to allow those drinking water users to pay for utilities for water treatment costs. So, thank you.